Michelle Del Rosario Martinez, running in California Assembly District 41 against John Harabedian. Welcome to the podcast this evening.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a little bit late, so the sunlight has gone down. We've got the artificial lighting up here to
Yes.
try to fill in a little bit of the gap.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and like I said, I've been here since 7:30 this morning doing interviews, and it was dark when I first showed up, so we had to use the light then. Afternoon, have the beautiful light, and then now it's a little bit tougher.
Well, I appreciate you doing this for me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So I always just start with some personal information first, just so the voters in your district get to know you as a person, as a candidate. And you were the daughter of Peruvian immigrants. And it just so happens that those Peruvian immigrants are here with you this evening.
Yeah.
It was nice to meet
daughter
them.
with me.
Yeah. So how long have you been in California? Just talk a little bit about the areas that you've been, and then how long you've been in the current district.
Sure. So I'm a first generation American. My parents came when they were 19 in the 60s, early 60s. So we've been here quite a while. My parents came chasing the American dream, and they obtained it. You know, they've had successful careers, raised their family here, bought a home in Pasadena, California. We eventually moved to Azusa, California. I went to school at Glendora High School, so to ensure that the high school I went to was going to prepare me for college, so to say, which was something that they were already worried about even in the 80s in Pasadena. So it was interesting that they decided that they would invest in a second home so that I could have that education. And
those are good parents.
Yeah, it is. I just recently had this story. I didn't realize it when I was a kid, but we had a little tuition envelope we would take to school. And I used to love when that time came around because I would go to school shaking it and there's all this change in it, you know. And I used to think, oh, it's so cool, you know, I used to shake it. And now I realize they probably were like scraping together every nickel and dime they could find to make sure that I had a good education. So I went to St. Philip's in Pasadena for my elementary and through 7th grade. And then we moved into the Glendora Schools District, and I went to Sandburg and graduated from Glendora High School. And my parents taught me that anything was possible in America, so I grew up that way, tenacious. I went straight to work out of high school. I had a cousin who was working for a law firm, and she said, hey, do you want a job? I'm like, sure. I had no experience. I had volunteered for the Boys and Girls Club, so I had that under my belt, and one other job, I can't remember what it is right now. But so I went to my high school typing teacher because we were still doing it on typewriters back then, and I said, hey, can you write me a letter of recommendation? I didn't even know what I was asking for. I just kind of had figured out what I needed, and I went to that job interview, and I have just always been tenacious. I told them, give me a chance. If I don't do this right, you can fire me in a month. And that's kind of how my career took off.
That's how you got into law, and then you eventually became founder and CEO of M3 Solutions, where you continued working with law firms. What did you do for them?
So I implemented enterprise systems globally. I ended up becoming very specialized in what I did. It was when the EU decided to form, the statutory regulations really affected U.S. companies, especially U.S. law firms that were service-based. And here in the United States, we don't tax for services, but everywhere else in the world they did. So it was a complete overhaul of how we did business here in the United States for law firms. And then at the same time, the industry was turning to electronic billing, which was a huge endeavor for especially global law firms. So I just found a niche for myself, and it was amazing. So I went from one major law firm to the other and built my career out of that.
So business and law, and now on to politics.
Yes.
What triggered you to begin moving into politics?
Well, I think I've always had it in my blood. My grandfather was in politics in Peru. And there was something that was very poignant. My parents took me to Peru when I was 18, and that was with the late 80s, and Alan Garcia had basically staged a military coup in Peru. And I remember at night driving and seeing the tanks on the corners, and then the sirens would go off at 10 o'clock at night. There was a curfew. And he would
And here I
come
thought
on.
the political situation in California was getting bad. At least we don't have to deal with that
Well, you know,
yet.
it looks a
Fingers
little,
crossed.
yeah, it looks a little familiar. And that was just it. Alan Garcia would like command the television at 10 o'clock at night, and he'd just go on. And the image that stayed with me is he'd throw his head back and he would cackle, like literally cackle, and they called him the crazy horse. And so I was like, yeah, voting is important. And I always took it seriously. So I always had it in my blood, but then, you know, work happens, life happens, and, you know, you're trying to carve out your career and not really paying attention. But after the Obama administration, I had had enough pretty much, and more so from the aspect of being a Christian and having to suppress my beliefs in the sense that, you know, this whole political correctness had come in where we couldn't even wish each other Merry Christmas. We were supposed to say Happy Holidays because someone may be offended. And I think that there is that room where we can practice the tenets of our belief without disrespecting another individual, and especially in the workforce, you know, where instead of being inclusive of all, which really would be wonderful, I think, we're being exclusive and just letting one individual decide what's best for all. And so I think we suppress our voices and the possibility of what really America was, which was supposed to be this melting pot, which means that we have to be open to one another.
Yeah, and it does seem like both political parties always try to smear the other side with something, and it does seem recently that if you are religious, that the left tries to smear you as, I guess, a Christian nationalist, or they come up with different terms now just to try to automatically paint you into something.
Sure.
And that's why I'm creating a podcast like this, so that I've had a lot of fairly religious people, including the person who was just here, Elizabeth Wong Allers, and they talk about their religion, but I'm hoping that people will see that that doesn't mean that you're crazy on, you know, a broad range of issues. It just means that you have a different way to show your care and concern, and a different set of values that aren't bad. It's just a general caring of people, and that kind of goes into your political campaign slogan, which is love, hope, and work.
Right.
So why did you pick that? Because Elizabeth had 4 L's, like life, love, law, and one of them, one
Liberty.
other one,
Yeah.
liberty. There you go.
Well, I actually started from a biblical perspective. Like, how can we speak about these things in terms that is for everyone? And so we can, and I've always tried to be positive about everything. So we can talk about the divisiveness, or we can talk about what love does, right? Love creates an environment where we try to understand one another, where we try to be open to one another. And so that instead of running on particular issues, as a conservative, I think, or even as a Californian, we all have the same desires, which is to, you know, be prosperous, be able to have a job. If we have children, that they have a good education, that they be ready for the world. I think these are common sense values that everybody desires to a certain degree, depending where you are in life. But for me, it's as we talked about, you know, there's Democrat, there's Republican, and the people are somewhere in the middle, and we really need to go back to serving the people versus ourselves. And I think it's very politicized in the sense that legislators today just want to win, but at what cost? Because it shouldn't be at the cost of the people.
Yeah, and going off of that, this year, more than any other year I've seen recently, voters are spending a little bit more time trying to learn who their candidates are and where they stand on the issues. More people that I've talked to are trying not to be labels voters, which we've always done in the past. It's, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to vote all Ds.
Right.
I'm a Republican, I'm going to vote all Rs. And that doesn't seem to be working for a lot of people on both sides of the aisle, for that
Right.
matter. And
Right.
particularly here in California, where the Democrats have had a mega majority for the last 10 years, and the state is not going the direction that Democrats want it to go. So they're kind of wondering where the disconnect is and trying to find representatives that they feel have integrity and are taking a closer look at the issues.
Absolutely. Well, I like to put it this way. They've had the trifecta for the last 13 years because in 2011 they took the governor house, which gave them the trifecta, but they've had the Senate since 1972 and it's never gone back. They've had a majority. They took the assembly in 1996 and they've had it ever since then. So they've had both the Senate and the assembly, so both houses of the legislation for over 30 years. And they could even say, well, the governor didn't want to pass the bill, he vetoed it, but they've had the trifecta since 2011. So in the last 13 years, everything that we're feeling here in California, experiencing, it really has to do with Democrat policies. And not that I want to put one party on the chopping block, but we have to ask ourselves, how is California treating us? Because we only have one voice in this state.
It's a valid, logical argument. And when you're out in the district, I assume you've talked to hundreds or even thousands of people in person now.
Absolutely.
What's the feeling from both sides of the aisle across the political spectrum? Are you seeing independents and Democrats who are open to voting for a Republican for the first time?
We just had a candidate forum held by the NAACP and the Women's Voter League, so I was very grateful to that. And so the NAACP tends to be left-leaning, right? And same thing with the Women League of Voters, which is supposed to be nonpartisan, but I've seen in recent years kind of some of the messaging they put up. But
well, I ran as an independent candidate. They hosted a debate up in my district for the U.S. congressional candidates, and I'm pretty sure they liked me. I was an independent.
That's great. And so it was a great room. Being in politics for as long as I have, I started back in 2012, so I've been around in my local area for quite some time. And so I knew a lot of the folks in the room were entrenched Democrats. They're part of our local party. And so it was really interesting because I wanted to understand what the feedback would be after the forum. And so I got a lot of good feedback, folks who are ready for a change. One, they see how it's affecting our education system, how it's affecting our parent rights, how it's affecting our economy, how it's affecting our safety and security. So there's a long list of where they haven't met their own goals. And it's not for lack of money, right? We know it's not for lack of money. California is one of the richest states, and yet we're in this huge deficit. We have this huge budget. When we talk about education, $103.3 billion in education from K to higher education. And we're churning out kids who don't know anything. If you look at the UC tables in the last 6 years, we've given 106,000 social study degrees. In architecture, it's only 3,000. In business, it's only, if I remember correctly, 14,000. So we're creating a system for these kids where it's all about more programming, more government, and these are kids that have nowhere else to go. And so it's as if our California legislators know it, and they just want to continue to grow government, which can be the solution if we had leaders who were willing to hold people accountable. We just back in April saw the report with the homeless, or we didn't necessarily see the report, right?
Where the $24 billion went.
Nobody knows.
Yeah, and both sides of the aisle is concerned about that on the left and the right, we're compassionate. We're willing to spend some of our tax dollars on programs that we know will lift others up, but that doesn't seem to be happening no matter how much money we're throwing at the problem. So we'll go issue by issue now and try to figure out what some solutions are to these problems. Some measurable outcomes is what some of the other candidates say. And but before we do that, as I had mentioned right about before we were starting to interview, I went through your website and you didn't have very strong policy positions on any of the issues, and you said you had a reason behind it.
Yes,
so I will let you explain that now.
Because I think that what we're trying to talk about does require for us to be relational. And especially running as a conservative, it's very hard to be able to illustrate in, a minute or less, because that's pretty much the attention span we have of folks nowadays. Even for those that are searching, they want quick details. And what we've experienced here in California, it's not going to be explained in one paragraph or in a one-line sentence. And so I think we have to be relational about it. So for me, I really wanted to emphasize my values versus the issues, because the issues are very big. The causes are very big. They're complex. California is huge, and we have tons of programming. We have tons of government, right? And so what we have to really be looking at is leadership, I think, more than programs. Because when you look at a state like California, people go, oh, well, how can you run it? What kind of experience do you have? I may not have experience in government, although I did run for local office and I was councilwoman for 2 years in Altadena. But this type of government that we're talking about at the state level, it requires good leadership, because we have experts in everything, for everything. So what we require is that accountability to say, okay, well, if we're going to discuss this matter, for instance, I just spoke to the insurance industry, right? And they wanted to illustrate for me the crisis that they're in, and I understand that. But how do we think outside the box? Because it's not just throwing more money at it. I just had this forum with my opponent, and he was saying, I'm going to go to Sacramento and fight for more money. And I'm like, who are you fighting? They're your own people. And how much more money do you want? Gosh. So for me, it's more about how can we talk about those values. And for me, like I said, it's about love, hope, and work. Why? Love gets us talking to one another. Hope endures all. That means we wake up tomorrow. It's a new day. New possibilities. I was raised that way. That's the American spirit. Yeah. And then work. If we can create an environment where people are thriving, then that's the American dream, the pursuit of happiness. So I want that for folks. Now, when we talk about the issues, if we talk about education, if I just say, I'm for parent rights, well, that's just about what every conservative candidate has said.
Well, so then, since you brought up education twice, we'll just kind of cover the topic broadly. And I can't say that I've covered issues on a values basis before, so this will be a little bit new to me. But let's talk about how you would apply your values to the education system and the concerns about parents' rights being eroded and not being informed by schools about issues pertaining to their children, the state trying to not allow parents access to certain medical records, other sensitive information, and allowing individuals other than the parents to make very impactful decisions on the kids. So just tell me how you address education and parents' rights, and I understand they're kind of separate issues, but they're tied together in the school system.
Yes, because I do think that there's, the sense of the parent having the mandate to rear their child is kind of what brings it together. What we have to ask ourselves is, what is the catalyst, right? How did we get here? Those are the questions we don't ask ourselves. We got here because we had the intentions of trying to help underserved individuals who felt that they were marginalized or treated badly. But what we've done in an effort to try to work as Americans, because I think we all have the freedom of speech, we all have the right to safety, we all have the right to have discourse, whatever we might believe in. I don't have to agree with you, we can agree to disagree. But that's the American way. And so where we've gone from that is, I believe when we work from a place of fear or a place of pain even, I concede to that. There's a lot of painful situations that transpire, but when we make decisions based on those painful experiences that are very specific to one segment, and then say we have to re-educate an entire population, to now the extreme where it's sexualizing the children, right, without understanding if we have the consent of the parent. Do they want their children to be exposed to that? So in our efforts to try to educate a generation with what a particular group is encountering, we went from one extreme to the other. So it's very bipolar. Instead of asking ourselves, what is the real question here? So if you've been marginalized, if you've experienced, even a hate crime, in that situation, then let's exercise the law, but we don't necessarily change the rights of our parents, the innocence of our children. We don't put those at stake for the purpose of trying to mitigate what's happening with a sector or what have you. And so for me, when we look at those values, we say, well, if we use a broad brush and go, everybody's going to be introduced to the LGBT community, everyone's going to be introduced to transgenderism, everyone's going to be introduced to sex, right? Because one thing is biology, another thing is, sexual acts, and how do you perform them, and how do you, it's just, we go from one.
So where does the values, I guess get cut off?
Yeah.
Right? Well, like, where are you allowed to teach within the education system, the taxpayer-funded public education system?
I think we had it right at one point. I remember sitting down and being taught biology, and I came home and my mom sat me down and she gave me her values, and that's where it's different for every individual. There's the biological, and then there's the value system that should come from the parent.
Sure. So it sounds like just keeping it at more of an academic environment instead of a social environment when it comes to sensitive personal issues like this.
Absolutely.
How do we fix the other part of education, which is the rigorous academic education, the reading, writing, and arithmetic? Because California seems to continue be declining across the board.
Absolutely.
It seems like in 2012, we were ranked somewhere around 32nd out of 50, which wasn't great. And now we're ranked around 44th, or perhaps even lower than that, and we continue declining. And obviously that means that our kids are not going to be prepared, just like you were talking about previously. Does that mean we have to take a look at our curriculum and incentivize, prioritize certain majors and academic rigor that will benefit kids, or how do we address the continuous failing of education?
Well, and I think it all affects one another, right? The leadership that you have at the top sets a tone, which, the superintendent rolls out, which the school boards agree to, which, so we've seen even with recent legislation that passed as SB, what's it, 1919, is that what it is? I can't remember the exact number, but having to do with children's rights and the transgenderism. So when a child has questions about their gender and they go to their parents and they don't get the response that they thought, and they go back to their counselor, they go back to their school, and they share with an individual at school what transpired at home, now we're opening the door to possibly pulling that child out of the home, bringing other departments into it to assess the scenario, because it's been categorized as mistreatment of a child, right? Do you pull that child out of the house? I mean, to me, that we've gone too far. At that point, we've said that the state knows more than the parent does. And so we have to get back to using the compassion and the love, because every scenario is going to be different. And we're humans, right? So you employ someone to do a job, they should be able to go into a scenario and assess it, and there should be enough, we have to have boundaries and parameters for everything, of course. You set structure so that there's safety and security, but there also has to be the ability for an individual to go in and assess a scenario and go, well, this is obviously just a question for the parent to discuss with the child, to maybe get therapy, but not a scenario where you pull a child out of a home. So, and
then let's go on to an issue that's kind of related to this, and I guess would require a similar line of thinking, which is just mental health drug crisis, and that also ties into homelessness, because a lot of the homelessness is caused by open air drug use. People get addicted, and then they live in situations that they would normally never live in because their cognitive abilities have declined. And so this is another area where some people on the right believe that the incarceration should go up. That's how you handle the situation. You pull them off the street, put them in jail and prison. Other people believe that you put them into rehab, mental health facilities. So applying the values that you have to this problem, what's the solution?
Yeah. Again, it's looking at what's the catalyst, and you mentioned it. Is it an addiction? Is it mental health? At some point, we have to be able to be okay with people not liking us, and that means I'm going to love you in a time when you don't know how to love yourself, because that is true human dignity. When we say, oh, that's our neighbor on the street, and we just step over them, that's not dignity. And as a society, we should be able to love one another enough to recognize that when we need to help another individual because they're not loving themselves. And I think that there are great programs out there. You know, we don't have to go far. Just right here outside of LA is the Dream Center, and it's ran by the Barnett family, and they bought an old hospital, and they have a recovery center there, and they've been amazing. They served millions during COVID. They actually had a whole operation where they used their parking lot, and they went to the food banks, and they just had pallets delivered. You know, they have a circle. You know, went to volunteer during the whole COVID situation, and the cars would just drive through, and we'd set off the food. But they also have a rehabilitation center, so they take, you know, X amount of people every year. They get them rehabbed. They introduce them to the program. They give them a purpose. You know, they're working with the program, and then they're offered the opportunity to help the next generation. So there are amazing programs like that that we really should be looking at. And for instance, the church I'm talking about, the Dream Center, Adam Schiff was asking folks to, you know, hey, come on over to the Dream Center. There's food. You can get fed here, you know, and I also helped when they opened up, they took their whole parking lot on the other end of the property, and they set out tables, and they just had laptops and desktops and iPads, whatever, you know, people could donate. And so for the underserved, the kids that, you know, when they transitioned to online school, they had nowhere to go because these were kids from underserved communities. So they came to the Dream Center. And when they tried to file for FEMA assistance, FEMA denied them because they weren't an official, you know, GMO, whatever. So it's
so then
really
how do you sort
disappointing.
out organizations like the Dream Center, and I don't know their history, if they successfully rehab people and they get them back into the community, and then they stay a part of the community and become a contributing member of society? Because as we alluded to in the beginning, California taxpayers, we want to be compassionate, but there is a lot of mismanagement of billions of dollars addressing the homelessness problem, and it seems to be getting worse. So 25 to $35 billion a year on the problem, and we know that that must mean, just by basic logic, that a lot of the programs are not working.
Well, inherently, there's a problem in there that nobody discusses, and that's the fact that when we give it to the government to take care of, we've basically said we're okay with having this problem go on forever, because we don't have, we've never adopted the idea that we should work ourselves out of a job. And in the business world, that's how we work. We work ourselves out of a job because that means we've maxed out, you know, optimum capacity.
You put the software into the law firm, and now you're on to the next one.
Right. And so it's the same thing. When you have a problem and you give it to the government has now created an agency. That agency now has a labor force. That labor force has to be employed. That labor force comes in every day and does a job. They're not looking at it like the Dream Center, who says, here's a hurting person, how can I help them? And so the Dream Center is going to want to help that person. The labor force at an agency is going to clock in at 9 o'clock and, you know, do their best, but they're more worried about their job.
So how do you set up the proper structure to make sure that there's some kind of a measurable outcome that will eventually, unfortunately, put these nonprofits out of business if they are successful? And your answer is almost identical to one that Jim Shoemaker, who's running for California Senate near my district, gave, in that he was talking to people from nonprofits and saying, what's your objective? And they were saying to help as many people as possible. And he said, no, your objective should be to put yourself out of business.
Right. Absolutely. I agree 100%.
Okay.
And so we do that by really understanding that we need less government, right? So as leaders, we can be asking ourselves, what is really working? Because there are measures for that, right? How many homeless people, we're counting are homeless, right? So we know how many, where has it grown? Where has it dropped? Where have we had more criminal incidences? So we really need to be thoughtful leaders, and we have to have those hard conversations, and we have to be okay with downsizing government, because if we don't do that, we're never going to be able to drive that law. When something's broken, you have to be okay with drawing a line in the sand and starting again. And that's the thing with government.
Sure.
They'll never admit that to themselves.
Got it. Then going along the lines of drawing another line in the sand, let's apply the same kind of reasoning to the crime and safety problem. Prop 47 has stirred up a lot of controversy. That was the law that put the benchmark for a felony all the way up at $950.
Yeah.
The idea behind it was good, that a lot of the people who are incarcerated as a result of the previous law were nonviolent offenders, and we want a lower prison population,
Right.
which would help taxpayers. But it's caused other problems, whether foreseen or unforeseen. And obviously Prop 36 is on the ballot this year to undo that, because, and it has over 70% approval according to the latest polling. So how do you apply this to solving the theft and other criminal activity that's a result of it?
Yeah, very good question. At the end of the day, again, it's about who are we trying to help? So if we're just trying to be political about it, then we're not going to get the right answer. But if we really want to look at the problem and say, how do we fix this? Then we start looking at where are those bottlenecks, like for what, or, you know, for lack of a better word. We have exhausted law enforcement, right? We don't have enough of them. We've cut our budget. They should be in our communities. They should understand the community they're working with. When you have a short and tired law enforcement that has to go into a situation that they have no clue, right? They have just a few seconds to assess. There are opportunities to not really understand what's going on. But if that individual is in the community, if, you know, we went back to those days where our officers actually knew the people in their community and could say, hey, yes, we know this person is a troublemaker, or this person maybe just is having, you know, a mental issue, then they would know how to address it because they know their community. But what we're doing is we're sending them in blind. They're tired, they're exhausted. And we've created a community where, in the effort of social justice, we've created a divide. And so there isn't those bridges that we used to have in the community where they could talk to one another. And it only is exponentially made worse by our leadership that keeps taking away the authority from our law enforcement, versus really understanding the role of law enforcement in our communities, which is to build communities, to build relationships in communities, keep us safe, be able to assess the scenario, be the first one on site to say, yes, I understand what's happening, versus what we're seeing today.
What about the level above law enforcement, which would be the district attorneys and the judges? Because the law enforcement can do everything that they can possible, and then it's ultimately up to the authorities in the justice system above them to determine what's going to happen with the people who are arrested. And a lot of law enforcement that I've spoken with are demoralized because in certain areas, Los Angeles included. George Gascon has been under a lot of fire. And actually on the way in here this morning, I was listening to local radio, and an independent district attorney candidate who's running against him wants to go back to what he called the hard middle. He thought that LA basically had it right back in 2014. I can't remember the name of the district attorney who was here. And so what's your thoughts on that part of the equation?
Well, yeah, that's definitely part two. And we've seen it where 3 times a day, somebody who has a petty theft crime can commit a crime, get booked, let go, does it again, let go, does it again. I mean, we've seen it 3-4 times in a day, so it's just ridiculous. And so we have to enforce the law, and whether that means, I don't always believe it to the fullest extent, but in assessing the scenario, if we have the right system that understands this, that's good. But we've politicized everything. We've politicized our judges, right? We've got a lot of foreign support through nonprofits and what have you that are really impacting what happens, and that's real. We can follow the money and see that we have individuals who are in here trying to light a fire to create chaos, and I think that's a very real part of what's happening in California, is that when you have leadership that's more worried about politicizing a scenario to get more funding or to implement some social justice reform that they think will work, and we've seen that they haven't, then we're not working for the people. And it's happening quite a bit in California. We see what George Gascon's done. I mean, he's literally let murderers out of jail, and so people are hurting. And then you see the other side of that, right, where you've got illegal immigrants coming into the country, and it's affecting the crime rates, and we've seen it across the nation. So folks are fearful, and I think that's also a recipe for disaster, really. When people don't feel comfortable in their communities, we have law enforcement that's exhausted. You have a DA that won't do his job properly, has politicized his position.
It seems like one side says lock them all up, the other side says let them all free, and the answer is somewhere in between, an individual basis, but we need a better system in order to handle it in a more consistent way.
Well, and there's just so much influence with regards to one party that believes one way is the right way without necessarily asking, what do the people need? And so, I just saw a whole judges panel this week, and I thought, and each one of them talked about, reform, 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 but not necessarily for the community safety. And so,
so they're prioritizing social justice above what's best for the public as a whole.
Right, yeah.
Okay. Going back to an issue you just briefly brought up, which is illegal immigration. It's obviously one of the top few issues, I would say, across the country, but also here in California. There's been a lot of controversy about some of the programs that are being passed out of Sacramento to provide various assistance to the illegal immigrant population, including health insurance to the tune of around $3, $4, $5 billion per year, as well as a bill that made it all the way up to Gavin Newsom's desk, allowing them to become part of a program to receive up to $150,000 for the down payment on a home, which he vetoed, of course. But it's still kind of pending out there and circling around. Maybe we'll come back
that
again.
Our legislators were okay with it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was passed through the Assembly and I believe the Senate. And so what is your take on that crisis? Because California is very lenient on this issue, and so illegal immigrants are coming to California as opposed to going to other states.
Yeah. And I think you define it well, because it's the difference between taking care of our citizenry, which includes immigrants who have come here lawfully, And it also, but the state, instead of worrying about its citizenry and its immigrants that are here lawful, are focusing their attention on the illegal immigrants and providing them services that they're not even providing their own citizenry, right? We can talk about veterans, right? We can talk about immigrants who have been here a long time working. I met a wonderful woman working in these buildings here. We're in downtown LA, and she was a maintenance woman, and she wanted to make additional income. And so she and I formed a relationship. She worked for me for almost 20 years until she retired. But she would be at my home, and we'd have these conversations, and she would tell me, it impacts me personally. I'm an immigrant who gave my entire life savings to be able to come to America, and you know, I'm a maintenance worker, and I'm being pushed out by these illegal immigrants that will work for less pay, have zero expectations. You know, they don't care if they get medical, they don't care if they get vacation time. They don't, you know, they're not used to getting paid $20 an hour.
Yeah. And they don't have liabilities like most Americans carry. So this is affecting a significant demographic in your district, because I just talked to John Briscoe, a candidate for U.S. Congress, and he said that, yeah, his district has a large Hispanic population, and their wages are deflating because of the illegal immigration problem.
Yeah, 59%.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, 59% in our education system. I'm not sure what it is in the district at this point. But yeah.
Okay. Let's cover another issue which relates directly to this and the depression of wages, and that's, of course, probably the problem that's at the top of everyone's list, which is the cost of living and inflation, which has gone up significantly over the last 3 to 4 years and is now making California unaffordable for a lot of people. It's getting harder and harder to make ends meet. And we just talked a lot about programs that seem to be taking a lot of taxpayer money and not giving results. But are there any other drivers of the cost of living and inflation, and how do we tackle these problems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one, it has to do with all the programs we have in place, right? Instead of getting our kids ready for the workforce, instead of creating, right? Having manufacturing and having the opportunity to create here in California, we're taking it all overseas, and our kids are left with nothing here. So there isn't that opportunity for them that when my parents came, you know, my mom and dad worked for the McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, which are aeronautic companies, and my mom received her presidential award for working on the first motherboard on the stealth bomber, and my dad would subsidize.
That's pretty badass.
Yeah, she's awesome.
It's surprising. She's very unassuming for having done that.
Yes. And my dad would subsidize our income with doing in-house inventions for McDonnell Douglas. So he would look at the machinery and realize, like, you know, if you put a metal plate here, we'd lose less oil, blah, blah, blah. And so, you know, those royalties would be our Christmas gifts. And, you know, so they were just ingenuity. And so, but there has to be an environment for that. You know, when all the companies are leaving, you know, I mentioned the insurance industry, they've left. You know, major corporations that used to be in California, they're all gone. You know, it's a mass exodus. What are we offering our kids? You know, there's no job market here.
So then what can you do up in Sacramento to incentivize businesses to stay here and to recruit more?
Yeah, you incentivize business. You give them an opportunity to come back. That's true of everything, even in development, right? You know, we keep talking, like, you hear the left saying affordable housing, but that's just code for these mini homes that our kids are supposed to be happy living in instead of the real American dream, right? So we have to make it, we have to look at our programming. We have to say, where is all this money going? And is it effective? You know, I think Bukele said it best when he sat down to be interviewed with Tucker Carlson. He said, "What's wrong with America?" And he said, "Well, here's the sickness. You know, you look at the the Empire State Building. It's an amazing testament to American ingenuity. It was built in a year, and then you come to California, and there's a bullet train to nowhere that's cost us, I don't know, last time I checked, I think it was 16 billion. And
I
it's
think
still
more
not,
than that. I think 100 billion.
100 billion? Oh my
Yeah,
God.
and someone else brought that up earlier, and I said the same thing. I drove down here from the Bay Area with my pickup truck with these thrones and stuff in it, and every time I make the drive, which isn't that often, I think the same thing. It's a 2-lane highway all the way from the Bay Area down to LA, and what always happens is there's semi-trucks and slow cars, and then slow cars and semi-trucks to pass other slow cars and semi-trucks, and it slows everybody down to like 55 miles an hour for minutes. This happens dozens of times, so I made a little Instagram story on the way down saying, instead of building a bullet train costing $100 billion or trying to invent a new technology like the Hyperloop, why don't we just make a 3rd lane so that I can cruise 80 miles an hour and make it here in 4 hours instead of 6?
Thank you.
So it seems like a practical solution.
And that's exactly what we need in our leadership, is just common sense. It's just common sense. And a little bit of accountability too.
Absolutely. And one of the few things that I was able to find, I think it was in some kind of newspaper article about you surprisingly, getting the most votes in the primary election, was that you have a low tax agenda. So I would guess that to incentivize businesses to come back, you would be in favor of tax breaks.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then continuing on with the cost of living, obviously if we can increase the ability of our kids to get education in the areas they need and bring business back here, we'll have better high-paying jobs.
Absolutely.
But what about right now? Because that's going to take years in order to turn around. But we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis now for housing, for gas, for insurance, and even getting insurance. And what's driving that? And how do we solve it?
I'm not sure I understood what's driving that as far as, well, to me it's policy, if that's what you're meaning.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I'm just saying, is it, we did already talk about spending, which means that they have to pull more tax money from us.
Right.
Maybe we'll move into energy policy and regulation, because these seem to be two things that come up frequently.
Yes.
Some candidates argue that, for example, with housing, which is vastly unaffordable for most Californians now, regulations like solar on the roof and electric appliances and all of these different permitting that's required is driving up costs. What's your take on energy policy and other regulations?
Right. Well, I think we're having an existential conversation in the state, first of all. I know, for instance, the candidate forum we had in Pasadena, Pasadena has a completely carbon-free goal of 2030. We're in 2024. It's virtually impossible. So this is an existential conversation. But having said that, I do believe that, when we talk about values and how do we get there, you ask, what do we do right now in the immediate? What we do right now in the immediate is really set expectations to what is really before us. And that means having those conversations that our leadership isn't having those conversations ever with our citizens, right? We're never getting online. I mean, Gavin Newsom talks about how great California is doing when everyone knows we're in a huge deficit, right? And that inflation is through the roof. Nobody can buy homes. It goes on. And he paints this picture. I think California's had enough. And what we need to do is be realistic and reset expectations about what we can actually do. Because just to go out there and hurrah and be the cheerleaders for the environmentalists and the social justice warriors and all these folks, it's not going to get us back to where we need to be. And so it's a big state. We could be a country ourselves. We've got to really take a look at this and say, are we ready to make these changes? And it starts with the vote, right? On November 5th, we've got to vote in different leadership. We've got 8 people in the Senate, 18 in the Assembly, so it's not going to happen with just one election. But what we can start doing is having those real conversations about how do we get back on track. So when we do that, we have to now have those hard conversations and maybe not be liked. But if we had leaders who would be willing to do that in their districts, if they would come back and reset expectations to what they really need to be and look at those things that we can do immediately, right? Like you're saying, fix education, make it possible for businesses to, when we have to pay our folks at McDonald's and Burger King $20 an hour to flip burgers, you're not going to have people going there. You're not going to have families going to McDonald's anymore. And so when we set those kind of expectations where we're thinking, oh, well, we've got to raise the labor salaries because a father of four should be able to raise their kids by flipping burgers, that was never the expectation. You know, it's supposed to be a transition job for high school and college kids, and offering them a career, whether it's, you know, plumbing, architecture, law degree, whatever, you know, photography, whatever the person wants, but to create that environment where it's possible for them. I was talking to this doctor who had an amazing story. She was Haitian. She lost her parents when she was 10. She had to come here. She lived with some family. She just put herself through school. She was married. She went through medical school. All at the same time. She like didn't sleep days, right? Just typical story of somebody who just wants to make it, and that's such an amazing story. She came to buy properties in Pasadena. She's now in her late 70s. She considers this her ministry. She does sonograms for folks who, you know, have been diagnosed, and she really considers it a ministry where she can be able to pray with them and bring peace into their life. And luckily, she had a successful medical career and was smart to invest in property. But to have this, what she calls a ministry, but you and I know it's a business, right? She has to subsidize it with her other income, because by the time she ends up paying the taxes on that building, which she was lucky to purchase, right? And then the license for being a business owner, then the license for all the medical equipment, and the license for being a doctor, and she breaks even if she's lucky, you know. So you have to find other ways to subsidize it. And so when you think that, when we think about an individual like that who spent their whole life studying, working, did everything the right way, you know, invested their money, bought property, want to give back to the community, has this, you know, facility where she can provide sonograms for folks, and she's barely making it because of all the regulations and licensing fees, what have you. That's not conducive of doing business, right?
Okay. Well, we'll just hit a couple of other issues real quick, and then we'll wrap up. And one, we'll just continue going along the lines of sonogram and healthcare. Some of the California Assembly and Senate candidates and current office holders are in favor of a universal healthcare program. It wasn't able to be implemented at the federal level, obviously, and so the state of California wants to try to do it themselves. Where is your stance, and how do you apply values to providing health care for people who need it, and making sure that people who can afford it get the care that they want, and those who can't can get the care that they want?
I think that what we need to do is have a competitive market. When you have a competitive market, then folks can have choices. And I understand the other side of it, where they say, you know, we create an environment where you have folks who are ineligible. So if we can have that blended environment where we offer for the underserved the opportunity to be able to have subsidized healthcare, that's great. But it shouldn't be at the cost of the middle class. We've always promised saying, oh, well, it's not going to affect you, but we always understand that it has to come from somewhere. So it comes from the middle class. You know, the middle class it's impacted. I just had a friend the other day call me and said, I literally cannot afford my medical insurance anymore. It went from like, you know, $1,400 to, you know, double that. And so a lot of it has to do with the circumstances surrounding that.
And Sacramento says that healthcare for all would be the solution to that, and then people wouldn't have to worry about it. But then it seems like you're saying that just overall the quality of care will deteriorate, and it'll end up costing us anyway, just in the form of taxes.
I think we've seen that across various, you know, areas of influence, mountains of influence, in our education system, in our healthcare system, when we interject government and say, we're going to do this, we're here to help. We offer subpar programming, it's just a shame because that's not America. America is supposed to be, excellence, balance, justice.
And I would guess this take on healthcare and allowing it to remain in the private sector with healthcare insurance would be similar to your take on fire insurance and home insurance. You had already alluded to the fact that you met with insurance companies and they delineated their problems.
Yeah.
Are they saying that it's the regulations that are coming out of Sacramento?
Well, I think it's both things, right? The fires that we've seen that creates a crisis. There has to be new claims that come in order to be able to help, and that's not happening. With the situation that we have in California with regards to the fires and what happened there, they're not in a position to pay out.
Yeah.
They're really just not in a position to pay out.
Are fires an issue in your district?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
not in my, well, yes, actually it is.
Yeah, now.
Yeah, absolutely it is.
What's your position on, I'll just go into, the trade-off between environmentalism and, although some people would call sustainable foresting and clearing out the undergrowth and the brush,
Absolutely.
and
Yeah.
environmental.
Yeah, I think when it goes beyond common sense, it doesn't make sense anymore. We've seen it in where even California wants to cut back the underbrush, and these conservatory groups come in and go to the courts and ask for an injunction to stop them, right? And so there has to be some common sense in it. So everybody loves a good story, right? Everybody loves a feel-good story. And so what I had suggested is, well, why don't you go to these nonprofits and collaborate with them, and you can create a campaign around this. The state wants to collaborate, you want to collaborate, so it kind of puts the pressure on the conservatory groups to come along. And so sometimes we have to be willing to kind of, poke back a little bit like that and say, hey, if we can build the story, they will come, eventually they will have to come, because it doesn't make sense when you're the conservator, right? Your job is to say that you want to conserve the forest, and yet when you have
burns down.
So this is where we're
that.
not, yeah, we've gone beyond common sense now.
Okay, fair enough. I was looking at the numbers in your district. Historically, it's always split toward the Democrat candidate. In the primary election, you were the highest vote getter by a percentage, but it was because it was split between multiple Democrat candidates.
Yes.
And you're going to need to get about 10% of them to flip over to you in order to win the district.
Yes.
So what do you say to independent voters and to Democrats and to the Republicans to turn out for you in order to win the district?
Yeah. Well, my plea to them is, how is California treating you? If you're happy with California, if you're okay with the prices of our housing, of the cost of living, of the security in your neighborhoods, then we're probably not having the same conversation.
Yeah.
But if you ask yourself that question, how is California treating you, and you're not happy with the answer, then I would say, give me a try. It's 2 years. It's literally 2 years. And you can fire me in 2 years if I don't do a good job. But, the proverbial saying, to do the same thing over and over and expect a different outcome is insanity. And we've done that, for over 13 years now, where we've had a super majority of Democratic policies in California. And where do we find ourselves today? Our problems have gotten bigger. I can't point to one issue that hasn't grown and gotten worse. And so if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, what's the catalyst, right? And there's only one party we can point to.
It's true. It's a logical argument, and a lot of people are considering that this year. And like I had asked you before, how are you speaking to voters who are considering voting Republican for the first time ever?
Yeah. So for me, I think I think at the national level, federal level, right? They create a great campaign about making it red or blue Trump, Kamala, but we are the people, and it always comes back to local politics, and it's about what's going on in your community, and that's where we can be effective, regardless of what's might be happening at the national level, federal level. We can try to make things a little bit better in California, and actually, this is the state to do it in. We have so many resources at our fingertips that we could be employing, and because of the policies that we're currently trying to implement, it's just not working, you know. And that, I shouldn't say currently, because it's gone on for decades.
Sure.
So hopefully folks will be willing to take a sober look at what's going on, because I understand, you know, they love to politicize everything because it's just good for politics, but this is not about politics. This is about the people and what they deserve. And so hopefully we can get back to that, serving the people.
Okay.
You know, it was originally what our, you know, the whole point of it being only 2 years was because you had respectable people in the community, hardworking businessmen and leaders that would leave their business behind for 2 years and would go to the Capitol and serve their community and then come back home and someone else would do it. And seems like it became an issue when we integrated political science into our universities and made it a
went from being a
career.
public service
Yeah.
into something much more embedded than that. Well, thank you for coming this evening. I appreciate your level-headed and thoughtful and soft-spoken nature on all of the issues and approaching them from a little bit different perspective than most candidates do.
Thank you.
And we will leave the choice up to the voters with about three weeks left before the election.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, and if there's anything, you know, this has been a journey because I am a slayer by nature. I am a slayer, so it's only God, you know, transforming me, because I really do want to understand the brokenness, and I want to understand, you know, the pain that we see it all around us. And so, you know, to come at it from that place of indignation is not going to serve anyone. So for me, it really is that commandment to love first, and so I'm super excited. We'll see what God has in store, but I hope that California gives me a chance.
Okay, well, if the voters in your district want a slayer in Sacramento, now they know who to vote for.
Thank you.
Thank you.